attending today's ceremony. Ko Miriam Bookman toku ingoa. My name is Miriam Bookman and I am Deputy Chair of the Holocaust Centre. Welcome to this parliamentary reception for the United Nations International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I welcome all our guests here today. I welcome our host, the Honourable Grant Robertson, Deputy Mayor of Wellington, Sarah Furey, Members of Parliament, members of the Diplomatic Corps, the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO Secretary-General Vicky Soanes. Most importantly, I want to acknowledge our very cherished survivors and their families. We're here this afternoon because the UN General Assembly established UNIHID in 2005 to be commemorated each year on the 27th of January, the day when Auschwitz-Birkenau, the death camp, was liberated by the Soviet Red Army in 1945. The Holocaust was a deliberate attempt to exterminate the Jews, defined by anti-Semitic ideology, propaganda, legislation, and the systematic implementation of the unprecedented extermination techniques. The Holocaust did not happen in isolation, and many other people were also persecuted with dedicated measures. Some, such as the Roma people and the disabled, were targeted for extermination alongside the Jews, while many others were also oppressed by the Nazis on the basis of their ethnicity, political ideas, religious beliefs, or sexual orientation. It is for this reason that we come together as a community, that we commemorate, and that we honour the lives of those people who saw their lives tragically cut short by hate and intolerance. In the words of the United States Holocaust National Museum, together we will take this day to recognise our shared responsibility, to honour the victims of the Holocaust, teach the lessons of this history, and defend historical truth. Before we start this ceremony today, I'm just going to quickly read the safety briefing, but it's quite a comprehensive card, so bear with me. So, in the event of a fire, please evacuate the venue via the same route you entered or near the safest exit. Please follow the directions of security staff and fire wardens. The assembly point is outside at Seideman statue on the front lawns. In the event of a medical emergency, please refrain from calling 111, inform security or staff venue, and security will manage the event here. In the event of an earthquake, drop, cover, hold until it stops. Please keep away from windows and other obvious hazards in the venue and remain inside the venue and await instructions from security staff. The toilet facilities for the banquet hall are located in the far corner near the main entrance. Smoking, all Parliament buildings are smoke-free. You're welcome to smoke outside the main gates on Molesworth Street. And phones, please switch off your mobile phone to silent for the duration of the event. Okay, I think that's it. We can continue. So, all over the world on this day, the Holocaust is being remembered and thought about not only for its historic significance as a unique act of genocide, but also as a focus of reflection on the rise of anti-Semitism and prejudice around the world. We do have to be constantly alert to the dangers of these forces, leading to a repeat of large-scale racism, violence, and war. In recent times, and in the context of the global pandemic, we have seen the world, with New Zealand as no exception, prone to misappropriation and trivialisation in respect of the Holocaust. It is as important as ever to ensure that we remember what took place, educate those around us, and ensure that distortion and denial of the Holocaust does not occur. Very recently, a historic vote in the United Nations General Assembly urges 193 member states to reject, without any reservation, any denial of the Holocaust as a historical event, in either full or in part, or any activities to this end. The General Assembly adopted the resolution by consensus, meaning it was approved without a country-by-country vote. My hope is that this vote turns into action. that it marks a step forward, and maybe for some countries a first step, in planned action against prejudice, anti-Semitism and hate. In a New Zealand context, we hope that the UN resolution will help the delivery of the recommendation of the Royal Commission on the Christchurch Mosques massacre, that the government increase efforts against racism and for greater social cohesion. It is certainly for these reasons that the Holocaust Centre will continue with its core strategy to witness, remember, educate and act. It is now my pleasure to ask our host for today's reception, the Honourable Grant Robertson, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance and Member of Parliament for Wellington Central, to now address us.
O tihe Māori ora, he mihi ana na mana whenua ki tēnei rohi, a Taranaki whānui te upaka o te ika, te ati awa whānui katoa, tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou katoa. E nā tini mate, haere, haere, haere atura. Apiti hono tātai hono, rātou te hunga mate kia rātou. Apiti hono tātai hono, rātou te hunga ora kia tātou. E nā mana, e nā reo, a rangatirama, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou, a tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai ki te whare paramata. Welcome to Parliament. Miriam, thank you for your kind introduction. It is a select group of 100 exactly who are in the room today. You should feel honoured and proud to be a part of that group, but I do apologise to the Holocaust Centre and all of those who would have liked to have been here today. It is unfortunately the world that we live in, but I thank you very much for respecting the public health restrictions that we operate under. They are designed to keep us all safe, but I'm very grateful that we can all come together today in these circumstances to acknowledge International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Can I acknowledge all of the members of the diplomatic corps who are in the room today? There are many of you, so I will not go through you one by one, but I acknowledge all of you here today. I want to acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues, Greg O'Connor, the MP for Ohariu, Camilla Bellich, Labour List MP, Nicola Willis and Chris Bishop, National List MPs. Acknowledge all of them for being here today, and also Deputy Mayor of Wellington, Sarah Free. Sarah, thank you for coming along as well. Distinguished guests, one and all, no mai, haere mai, welcome along today. It simply is my job to welcome you, but I cannot resist the opportunity to pick up on a little on the theme of the day. And when we think about such a cruel, inhumane, and extreme extermination of a group of people, we can have a tendency, as Jeremy said when we were out at Makara earlier, to put it into a very impersonal context. That 6 million people should die is a number so vastly unimaginable that we put it into that statistic rather than into its individual set of circumstances. And that's why I was especially moved by both Eva and Boyd's stories earlier today at Makara, bringing that to us as a very individual set of circumstances, different, but both particularly insightful and moving. And so to Boyd and Eva, I say thank you very much for sharing those stories with us. It is acts of individual and collective resistance that we think of today. There are stories told often of the resistance forces throughout Europe. There are stories told, as we heard today, of individuals who supported and sheltered those who were being persecuted and lived under the threat of being killed. And as we reflect on those collective and individual acts of resistance, it is timely for us to think about what that means for us today. I acknowledge the presence in the room of our Chief Human Rights Commissioner, Paul Hunt. In New Zealand, we have had to face extraordinary circumstances, particularly drawn to our attention on the 15th of March 2019, of how hatred, bigotry, prejudice and violence can come together. And each of us in our daily lives, I believe, has a responsibility to stand up to that. We have a collective responsibility. We invested in the likes of Paul and his commission. We do it every day when we go to the United Nations, Miriam, and we support those resolutions. But it's the individual acts of resistance to racism, the individual acts of resistance to bigotry, the individual acts of resistance to dis and misinformation that I believe is the call of today's theme. We owe it to every single individual of the more than 6 million who were exterminated. We owe it to the survivors who I acknowledge again today. We owe it to the families of survivors. And I thought Eva captured well the trauma, sometimes the stigma that was associated with families of survivors. I acknowledge that we today owe it to them to make sure that our individual acts of resistance against prejudice continue. Each of us knows the moment in our lives, in our days, when perhaps we've turned away from those moments where we could show that individual resistance. And each of us knows that we can and should do better in those moments. But as a country, as a collective, we have an opportunity to lead, and we have an opportunity to say never again. Never again to the Holocaust, never again to letting go moments of racism, bigotry, or prejudice without resisting and showing our support for all those who have had to suffer this before. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. You are most welcome in the Houses of Parliament. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Minister. And just on the theme of individual action, the Holocaust Centre uses a very easy to understand term, I guess, for education in the classroom, and that is what it is to be an upstander. But I think what Grant has touched on is that is not just relevant to young people in education in schools, but each of in every one of us. What does it mean to be an upstander, and what can we do in our individual lives, young and old, to bring that to reality? We are now moving on to the lighting of the 6 candles in commemoration of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. As I said before, many other perished, but the 6 million has become a symbol in many candle lighting ceremonies around the world. So, to light the first candle, I call on Her Excellency Nina Obermeyer, Ambassador of the European Union Delegation, and Rachel Kalkoen, a Holocaust survivor from the Netherlands. For the second candle, I call on His Excellency Grzegorz Karwel, Ambassador of the Republic of Poland, and Mary Mowbray, CNZM, a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. I now call on Her Excellency, Ms. Mira Walberg, Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Elizabeth Blau, whose parents are among the righteous of the nations. Dina and Jan Weinbelt hid Yvonne Leviticus, a Jewish teenager, in Holland. I now call on Karen Puller, Honorary Council of Denmark, and Vera Egermeyer, MNZM, who is a Holocaust survivor, having been a child inmate of Terezin camp in Czechoslovakia. The fifth candle will be lit by Mr. Daniel O'Leary, Honorary Council of Sweden, and Ernie Rosenthal, a second-generation Holocaust survivor. Ernie is the son of Holocaust survivors, his father from Hungary, his mother from Austria. His parents fled Europe in 1939, arriving to New Zealand 3 days before the war began. The sixth candle will be lit by Paul Hunt, New Zealand's Chief Human Rights Commissioner, and Marcus Blomqvist, a Holocaust Centre board member and member of the LGBTQI+ community, which suffered incarceration and murder during the Holocaust. Could you please all stand for 1 minute silence in honour of the 6 million? Thank you. Please be seated. Now, the next part of the ceremony is a tribute to Paul Seideman, who sadly died last November at the age of 93. It's actually quite strange to be speaking at this ceremony this year without having Paul's warm presence sitting in the front row. Paul was a Czech teenager in 1942 when he was subject to the Europe-wide Nazi anti-Jewish machinery. Paul survived Lodz, Ghetto, and its liquidation, several labour and death camps, including Auschwitz, and was liberated by the United States Army from Dachau camp in April 1945. We're just going to watch a video dedicated to him. I'll now, after this, ask our host, the Honourable Grant Robertson, to present the prizes to the winners of the Paul Seideman Annual Composition Award. As noted in the video, this was established with a generous donation from Paul to support the Centre's mission to educate on the Holocaust. The awards are given in 3 categories for students in years 7 to 8, 9 to 10, and 11 to 13. And it's due to the Paul Seideman Annual Composition Award, the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand has seen an increase in teacher responses to our new programs being offered. From our online webinars to our teaching trunks, the Paul Seideman competition has helped to bring Holocaust education to an increasing number of students in schools around the country. Will the winners please now come forward one at a time? So first we have Sophie Anderson, Year 8 from Southland Girls High School in Invercargill. We now have Jamie Davies, Year 10 from Hauraki Plains College in Ngātea. And Eden Lee, Year 12, Westlake Boys High School in Auckland. Sorry, but I think we will actually come up for a group photo as well, if you could return to the stage very quickly. Please congratulate our winners again. So we're actually now going to hear from the prize-winning entries. So the first is Sophie Anderson, who will introduce her video.
Kia ora, my name is Sophie Anderson. I'm 13 years old and I attend Southland Girls High School. I love learning and enjoy dance, science, and being creative. I've read books, watched documentaries, and recently visited the Prisoners of War exhibition at the Air Force Museum in Christchurch. But learning about the White Rose Group was new for me, and it's given me a deeper understanding of the Holocaust. The challenge for the competition was to communicate how students' actions during the Holocaust impact our students' actions today. At first, I wasn't sure how I could film my response to this challenge, as I was working on my entry during lockdown. But as I learnt more, I knew it was essential to focus on keywords that would show the courage of the White Rose Group and the sentiment of never again. With the name Sophie being a connection, I started my video with the meaning of the name, which is wisdom. A quote that connected me with Sophie's story was, "Stand up for what you believe in, even if you're standing alone." I therefore wanted to show that even as an individual, starting with one voice, we can make an impact. Equally, I wanted to show the importance of having mentors who can help you understand ideas and events with empathy. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I hope my video encourages others to bring this quote of Anne Frank's to life. How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world.
Wisdom, the quality of having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. The quality of being wise. Wisdom, knowing when to stand up for what you believe in, even if you're standing alone. Wisdom, the meaning behind the name Sophie. Wisdom, what connects my story with Sophie's story. Kia ora, my name is Sophie. I'm 12 years old and I attend Southland Girls High School. I hope my journey of learning is as powerful as Sophie's, and that I can have the wisdom, like her, to change the world. Sophie was a key member of the White Rose resistance group, run by students at the University of Munich, who distributed leaflets to attempt to stop Nazi crimes. Her family listened to foreign radio stations and were upset about Sophie and Hans being in Nazi youth groups. They lived in constant fear of what was happening under the Nazi rule. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany, and Sophie's brothers were sent to fight. Sophie graduated from high school and went into service as a kindergarten teacher as a stepping stone to being able to study science at university. In 1942, she moved to Munich, where her brother Hans was already at medical school. He had served on the front line and seen the crimes. Hans was a part of the White Rose group, who had started printing and distributing leaflets, challenging people and their thinking. Sophie admired their courage to speak and saw how the truth had power. On February the 18th at the university, Sophie and Hans pushed a stack of pamphlets off a railing into the central hall. The janitor saw this and reported them to the Gestapo, and they were arrested and interrogated. Sophie's actions and others like her impact my story and my actions today. Sophie showed us that language is power, and the use of language can start conversations and open doors to make what might seem impossible possible. Like Sophie, I've had the chance to work with amazing mentors that have encouraged me to be brave and stand up for the change I wish to bring about. I've initially started alone, but then found others who could extend and challenge my thinking, helping bring about change for others. Like Sophie, I don't come first. Neither does my city or country. I'm a global citizen. I hold the power, like Sophie did, to choose my attitude and action. One way I can do this in today's world is through the Sustainable Development Goals. To me, education for all and gender equality are two important goals that will help turn racism and hate into tolerance and kindness. The world isn't about finding differences and making gaps wider. It's about finding similarities to strengthen collective action. Sometimes we are one person, but that one person may be just the puzzle piece needed to complete or start a conversation that can change someone's world. Sophie makes it clear for us, conviction, courage, and hope created change. It is up to us as a generation to promote our sustainable development goals and find ways to throw the pamphlets off the railing to reach a wider audience. At just 21 years of age, Sophie was beheaded for treason. Her words were, "Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. What does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action? If I can be that one person stirred to action, and if I can awaken others to a need that creates change, then I have represented wisdom and Sophie's courage to stand alone or with others to help achieve a more peaceful world."
Wow, thank you, Sophie, for that incredibly creative way of conveying such a powerful message, and certainly building on the theme of individual action in terms of what can I do to make a difference in this world. Thank you so much. Next, I'm calling upon Jamie to address us.
In a war of less than 1,000 people against a mighty army, no one doubted how it was going to turn out. This isn't a subject for study in a military school, but a major subject in a school of human spirit. During World War II, it was a daily battle to survive for the Jewish people. The Nazis' use of death and concentration camps took the lives of many and left many more traumatized. However, spiritual and physical resistance from the Jews made living in these unimaginable circumstances almost bearable. After the establishment of the ghettos at the end of 1939 and the beginning of 1940, Jewish people were living in fear of the unknown. They attempted to preserve their cultural, religious, and individual identities, as well as their previous ways of life. Through the creation of hospitals, soup kitchens, orphanages, schools, and orchestras, they provided each other with the will to live another day. This was the beginning of their spiritual resistance. Roman Kent, a Holocaust survivor, summed up the Jewish perspective perfectly when he said, "Resistance in the Lodz ghetto was the symphony orchestra. It was a mother giving a child a piece of bread to survive, because resistance doesn't have to be with a gun and a bullet." The Jews believed the biggest resistance to the Nazis was peacefully, through unity. I believe this quote is an incredible representation of the Jews' peaceful mentality. To me, this is proof that even in such a horrific event like the Holocaust, there is always something to be grateful for. On New Year's Eve of 1942, Abba Kovner, the leader of the Partisan group in the Vilna ghetto, realized Hitler's plan. He gained the understanding that the Nazis intended to murder every Jewish person in Europe. He believed the youth needed to be responsible for preventing it. Kovner created a message for all the Jewish youth in the different ghettos across the country. Jewish youth, do not trust those who are trying to deceive you. In front of our eyes, they have stolen our parents, our brothers, and our sisters from us. Hitler is plotting to annihilate all the Jews from Europe. Let us not go like sheep to the slaughter. The only response to the enemy is resistance. Brothers, it is better to fall as free fighters than to live at the mercy of murderers. Resist to our last breath. Kovner's communication was his personal way of resistance. The plan for mass deportation from the Warsaw ghetto had begun by the 22nd of July 1942, the largest ghetto in Europe. It held over 450,000 people who were ordered to report for resettlement in the east. This was disguised for deportation and slaughter. As a result of the devastating event, underground organizations were created to fight against the Nazis. The Jews had to decide between dying through fighting the Nazis with their human dignity intact or being murdered at the hands of the Nazis. When the 18th of January 1943 came, the deportation of more Jewish people neared as the Nazis returned. For the very first time, a group of Jews fought back. The Nazi soldiers fled the ghetto, though many died in a short street fight. This was believed to be the first time in the Warsaw ghetto Nazis had been killed. On the 16th of May 1943, the Great Synagogue of Warsaw was destroyed, along with hundreds of years of Jewish history in Poland. This was the declaration of the end of the uprising. If you held a minute's silence for every person killed in the Holocaust, you would stay silent for 11 years. To put that into perspective, that is more than 3/4 of my life and my entire education. It's hard to believe that not only were the surviving victims mentally and physically scarred from the actions of the Nazis, but had very little to return to after the war. Yet somehow they still remain positive. In my opinion, this is a true example of human spirit that us future generations should learn from. Through the actions of the brave Jews, they resisted the Nazis. Through spiritual, physical, and mental resistance, the Jews proved they would not go like sheep to the slaughter.
Thank you so much for those powerful words, Jamie. Resistance is actually a theme of this year's Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we'll be talking more about that later on in the ceremony. Next, I invite Eden to share his entry.
Never again. This statement is engraved on memorials scattered across the breadth of Europe, forming one of the last visible remnants of the Holocaust, in which over 6 million Jews would perish. Yet despite the grasp of the Third Reich, groups undeterred by fear rose up and resisted the crushing impositionment of the Nazis and its associates. These groups varied in both size and magnitude, from small families like the Dutch Overstegens in joining the Dutch resistance, through to the actions of the hundreds in the Warsaw Ghetto, or the thousands who valiantly fought for the Jewish Military Union. With the occupation of the Netherlands occurring in May 1940, the Dutch Overstegens saw the implementation of forced Jewish relocations from Amsterdam, resulting in the Dutch Jewish population of the Netherlands decreasing from 150,000 to a mere 5,000 individuals throughout the course of the war. For sisters Freddie and Truus Overstegen, they witnessed this firsthand in their city of Haarlem. The late Freddie stated in 2016 that she recollected Germans banging on doors that made so much noise you'd hear it in the entire neighborhood. It was very frightening. Thus, wanting to liberate their nation, Freddie and Truus joined the Dutch Resistance, a fleeting yet determined organization consisting of figures from the clergy, the former military, and everyday Dutch citizens who wanted to make a difference. It cannot be understated how much courage the Overstegens would have had to muster in order to join the resistance, given that Freddie at the time was only 13 and Truus 16. Being a 16-year-old myself, it is inspiring to see how both sisters put their own lives on the line in order to stop the everyday injustices that they were forced to witness. Both would have had so much to look forward to in life if they had just turned a blind eye. Yet they knew it would mean nothing if others were not allowed to have those very same experiences due to their race or beliefs. This was why both sisters went ahead with conducting missions for the resistance, even though the result was oftentimes the tragic loss of life for both sides. In some cases, Truus stated that it poisoned the beautiful things in life. But she went through with the missions because she knew that it would be for the greater good, which in her eyes was a continent at peace and one that would be filled with freedom and hope. 82 years from when they first joined the resistance, their message still rings true to both myself and countless others. When we see peace threatened and freedom stifled, even though it may be easier to turn away, to hide from the truth, we need to have the courage in order to confront those responsible directly, lest we repeat the mistakes of the past. Resistance was encountered in all facets of society, including those actively persecuted by the Nazis, most notably the Jewish inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto. Constructed in August 1940, the ghetto was meant to be a stopgap until the infamous Treblinka complex could be completed. However, this did not make the situation in the ghetto any better, as 450,000 individuals were crammed into its tight quarters. By summer 1942, it had become apparent that quote-unquote relocations to concentration camps would soon occur. So the Jewish Military Union, or Żydowskie Związek Wojskowy in Polish, with initially a mere 20 members, had taken up arms smuggled in by sympathetic Poles and couriers for the Polish government in exile, in an attempt to prevent what many knew would be the extermination of all inside the ghetto. The ZZW reached 500 members by summer 1942, enough for an uprising. Thus, later in summer, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising had occurred. In all, the uprising significantly hampered the transport of ghetto inhabitants to both the Treblinka and Majdanek complexes significantly, saving innumerable lives. However, most Żydowski Związek Wojskowy members were captured, most notably the unknown Warsaw Ghetto boy, known from the 1943 photo captured during the ghetto's dissolution. After the war, the photo would become the symbol for resistance against the horrors of human conflict. This spoke greatly to me as it served to remind me of New Zealand's own Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, the penultimate symbol for those who had served New Zealand but could not be reconnected physically with their identity. Although their names may have slipped through the cracks of time, we will always remember them, each as little but nonetheless significant pieces that make up the complex mosaic of our nation's identity. Similar to the actions in the Warsaw Ghetto, outside in the main city of Warsaw, the Polish underground government had also planned an insurrection. This insurrection started on the 1st of August 1944 and was spurred on by the plethora of socioeconomic issues that Poland saw under occupation, including crackdowns on free speech and commerce. The diversity of the insurrectionists' backgrounds cannot be understated, as people from all backgrounds united against their occupiers. Such was the case of August Brown, who was of Nigerian descent. As Brown was a subject of the British Empire, his family urged him to emigrate to the United Kingdom, preceding the imminent invasion of Poland. But Brown refused, stating his intentions in preserving the sovereignty of his beloved country. The story of Brown gives an important precedent for us today, as he shows that resistance is not something that belongs to the domain of any particular group of people. Instead, Brown has shown us that resistance is a universal tool which each of us have been endowed with in order to do what is right, not only for ourselves, but others too. In Brown's instance, his actions also distracted the overstretched Nazi troops enough that it indirectly facilitated acclaimed photographer and resistance fighter Eugeniusz Lukowski in capturing more than 1,000 images of war-torn Warsaw. Even today, all these photographs still hold special significance to the Polish state in remembering the 63-day Warsaw Uprising, so that future generations may learn of the enormous sacrifices that Brown, Lukowski, and countless others had given. It is at this moment I would also like to acknowledge the sacrifices that the late Paul Seideman has made for HCNZ. Paul would be 13 when he was sent to the Lodz Ghetto before being transported to Auschwitz. Around 1.3 million people were forced into the facilities at Auschwitz. 1.1 million of those would never step out alive again. Paul was one of the lucky few who managed to make it out at aged 17. Yet instead of living in fear's shadow of what he had endured and witnessed, Paul would eventually create the Paul Seideman Annual Composition Prize for students across New Zealand to partake in. I can say with much certainty myself that this opportunity has opened my eyes and allowed me to learn much more about the Holocaust than I would have ever anticipated. And I can say with much certainty that the hundreds, if not thousands of students that would have taken part over the years would have the exact same thing to say. To conclude, while it is important to reflect on the inhumanity of Nazi Germany and how it ruthlessly separated people based on differences, the remarkable actions of groups such as the Overstegens, the Jewish Military Union, and the Polish underground resistance have left their mark on history by choosing to stand in defiance of terror when others simply accepted Nazi rule. Their stories set an invaluable precedent, so even when we face adversity against the good of mankind today, we too must stand up, even if those around us remain silent. Thank you.
I'd just once again like to congratulate our 3 award winners for their incredible contribution and incredible public speaking up on stage as well. So thank you again. We will now watch a video from the Israeli Knesset member, Moshe Turpaz.
Standing before you here, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann, I do not stand alone. With me stand 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet, point an accusing finger towards a glass booth and cry, I accuse. For the ashes are piled on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka, washed away in the rivers of Poland. The graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. The blood cries out, but the voice is not heard. I, therefore, will be the mouthpiece, and in their name I will unfold the terrible indictment. With these words, Attorney General Gideon Hausner began his opening statement at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in April 1961. Honorable Grant Robertson, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, members of the board of the Holocaust Center of New Zealand. Today, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day 2022, we remember those who resisted the Nazis during the Holocaust. When we speak of resistance during the Holocaust, I suspect that the first picture that comes to mind is one of fighters, of partisans, of armed struggle, of rebellion. Indeed, despite all odds, men and women throughout Europe stood up against the Nazis and fought back against them. The symbol of Jewish resistance to the Nazis is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, whose anniversary is the date of Israel's own Holocaust Memorial Day. This was the largest Jewish rebellion in which the Jewish prisoners of the ghetto in the Polish capital fought the Germans to try to prevent additional transports to the Treblinka death camp. The uprising failed. The residents were sent to the death camps, though a few managed to escape and join the underground resistance to the Nazis. But the spirit of this rebellion continues to inspire the Jewish people and freedom fighters around the world to the present day. But today, International Holocaust Memorial Day 2022, from this distinguished forum, I would like to address a different type of resistance. I speak of those people, the oppressed, weakened, miserable, persecuted people who, despite the circumstances and terrible conditions, refused to forget their humanity. They resisted attempts to strip them from the sense of humanity, even at great personal risk, during the darkest time known in human history. When I hear of resistance, my mind recalls the starving Jewish man from the Krakow ghetto, by now basically skin and bones, who for 3 years has not eaten food fit for human consumption, who gives his last bits of bread to his neighbor because he is dying, because he now needs this food more. My thoughts wander to that group of Hasidim taken to be killed at the Plaszow camp, who started dancing, that group of young men, happy and dancing, dancing and singing, as they jumped into the pit on the way to their deaths, as the hail of bullets rained down upon them. That is how they met their death, with the joy of life. And I think of the righteous among the nations, Irena Optiker from Poland, who hid 12 Jews in the basement of her home. Henrietta Voiter, who smuggled children out of the Westerbork camp in sacks of potatoes, milk cans, and bags of laundry, and brought them to Dutch families who sheltered them. These too are heroes. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, wrote in his books about the experience of death and also offered a new perspective on life. In his famous books about the man's search for meaning, he described how he managed to find hope in the midst of the horrific suffering by clinging to the smallest things in life: a growing flower, a memory of a loved one, a smile from someone in the middle of a dark time, choosing life despite death. We promised ourselves never again. The Jewish people live today in Israel and around the world, and the Jewish people will continue to live. I would like to thank all of you, members of the New Zealand House of Representatives and all the other participants, to affirm the ties between me, a member of the Israeli parliament, whose parents immigrated to Israel from England nearly 70 years ago, and you, the citizens and elected officials of New Zealand, and to promise never again.
A virtual thank you. Our theme for this year's commemorations is resistance, and you've heard much on that theme already. The theme is resistance in its many different forms against the genocidal aims of the fascist and Nazi regimes. There were revolts and concentration and death camps, partisan bands in the forest and marshes, clandestine Jewish and cultural activities in the camps, and the saving and hiding of Jews by non-Jews throughout occupied Europe and North Africa, often at risk of their own lives. We're now going to hear a poem on the theme of resistance read by Michaela Levy-Williams. The poem is called Resistance Is by Chaim Guri and Monia Avrahami.
Resistance is. To smuggle a loaf of bread was to resist. To teach in secret was to resist. To gather information and distribute an underground newsletter was to resist. To cry out warning and shatter illusions was to resist. To rescue a Torah scroll was to resist. To forge documents was to resist. To smuggle people across borders was to resist. To chronicle events and conceal the records was to resist. To extend a helping hand to those in need was to resist. To dare to speak out at the risk of one's life was to resist. To stand empty-handed against the killers was to resist. To reach the besieged, smuggling weapons and commands was to resist. To take up arms in streets, mountains and forests was to resist. To rebel in the death camps was to resist. To rise up in the ghettos amid tumbling walls in the most desperate revolt humanity has ever known.
Thank you so much, Michaela. Lottie Weiss, an extraordinary woman and survivor who passed away in Australia last year, was Michaela's great-great-aunt, which makes Michaela's contribution to this ceremony, in my view, an act of resistance in and of itself. May Lottie's memory be a blessing. Many thousands of Jews were saved from death by smuggling them to safety or by hiding them. The brave people who engaged in that form of resistance are recognised by the State of Israel as righteous among the nations, and more than 27,000 such awards have been made. We will now hear an incredibly inspiring story of a righteous couple in the Netherlands, Johan Fritz Harkins, who later immigrated to New Zealand. We're going to hear from them virtually as their family could not make it today due to the COVID pandemic situation, but are certainly here with spirit and here in spirit and are here online.
I ngā mana, I ngā reo, I ngā karangatanga maha, tēnā koutou. I would like to first mihi to Te Atiawa, mana whenua of the land where this ceremony is taking place, and secondly thank the Holocaust Centre for inviting our whānau to take part in today's proceedings. This is an honour and a privilege, particularly significant to our family as the Holocaust Centre has given us so much tautoko and guided us throughout our research. It was the Centre's education program that first screened The Power of Good, a film about resistance work, of Nicholas Winton in particular, when I was just 8 or 9 years old. Without this event, I would have never encouraged my nana to reignite her search for Ali and subsequently uncover my great-grandparents' resistance efforts. In the spirit of education as continued resistance, my grandfather, Marcel, Johan Fritz's youngest son, has decided to return the Righteous Among the Nations medal to the Wellington Holocaust Centre in a ceremony later in this year. Our family has agreed it should be shared with the young people of Aotearoa who come to learn the sentiments of never forget, never again. Johan Fritz's story is often glorified and commonly branded as heroism, but we know that for my great-grandparents following the war, their memories of resistance were remembered with neither admiration nor gloat. In fact, due to failed resistance efforts, Fritz almost never spoke of this time. It is only through the strong bond formed between Yo and my nana, Gloria, her daughter-in-law, that she passed on mere snippets of their experience. I imagine it was a similar mother-daughter bond with Ali that encouraged her to share this story with Gloria. Like many records of resistance, behind the films and novels is a sober and humbling narrative. Until we eventually found Ali, there was no triumph in the information that we had. After all, Johan Fritz never knew if Ali had survived. I often wonder if Johan Fritz would have been comfortable sharing this story, or even accepted much of their postpartum recognition, had they been alive today. What I'm trying to say is that, while I did not have the fortune to know my great-grandparents, at every step along this journey, their actions have been described to me as the default response. Looking back, knowing the horrors that occurred across the continent, it's easy to see these actions as stoic. But within the walls of the Huckins household, this was the obvious course of action. I'm sure the risks were heavily discussed, but after the fact, there was little to talk about. We will never know what evoked the resistance that followed. It may have been Yo's prior connection to the Zinovskis as their housekeeper. Maybe it was their youthful confidence. I don't want to reduce the complexities of the decisions involved during the Holocaust. However, learning about my great-grandparents has showed me that for Yo and Fritz, any compliance with hate was the unaccustomed action. I am not trying to downplay the importance of resistance, but rather represent the community effort that it took. Had there not been a mix of organised and spontaneous resistance from these like-minded people, many of the resistance efforts would have failed and never been attempted. Through this network, Fritz began sabotaging German airplanes, forging false documentation, and providing bicycles for Jewish people to flee the country. Yo sewed gems and valuables into the lining of Jewish children's jackets, and was probably largely responsible for caring for Ali in the first 2 years of the occupation. It's important in the story to also mention Ali's uncles, who themselves facilitated the temporary fostering of Ali to the Huckins family. They gave Yo and Fritz an opportunity to fight indifference, and themselves also saved lives of numerous other Jewish people around Holland. It's also important to recognise the Neal family, who sheltered Ali for the latter half of her infancy, when illness riddled the Huckins family home. Their resistance was in spite of indifference, but I imagine it also gave Yo and Fritz hope that their family would survive without having to compromise Ali's safety. Finally, it's crucial to mention Ali's mother Gita, who perhaps in this story sacrificed the most. Her parting with Ali, although necessary, must have felt far more bitter than sweet. This separation is something I think about regularly, and each time it would always emphasize the risk and emotional toll that leaving Ali must have had on Gita. The determination to see her family alive and prosperous is one that cannot be wholly described in a few sentences, but can be paraphrased by the word resistance. All throughout her life following the war, this continued. She immigrated many times and shifted her family for better opportunities, often as a single parent. She sheltered another Polish Jew who also had no family left, and so we see the spirit of resistance and self-sacrifice both during the war, when she fled from the Netherlands, and following the war within Gita herself. We wholeheartedly accept and are humbled by the recognition of Yo and Fritz as resistance members, but we know that it was beyond just personal sacrifice. It was the common ideology amongst many people, young and old, that facilitated and organised resistance. Before I end, I want to mihi to Ali Montagari, previously Ali Zinovsky, for allowing us to share her story and being so encouraging over the years. She is truly a loved member of the Huckins family, and through sharing her story has continued the spirit of resistance. I will leave you with some words from her. The opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. The opposite of beauty is not ugliness, it is indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it is indifference. The opposite of life is not death, it is indifference. Tēnā koutou.
Again, another virtual thanks for that presentation. And if anyone is interested in hearing more from the family, there was a lovely interview on RNZ this morning with Catherine Ryan that goes into more detail about the incredibly inspiring story. The Holocaust Centre is extremely grateful for this account and for the future presentation of the medal to the centre. The medal will be used by the centre to continue to educate right from wrong and what it means to be an upstander in difficult times. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, is charged with providing educational outreach on the Holocaust. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, it has been since 2009 the very supportive major co-sponsor of the annual Holocaust Remembrance Day, not only here in the capital, but also in Auckland, Hamilton, Christchurch, and now for the first time in Nelson. We are very grateful for this ongoing support. And I now invite Vicky Soanes, the Secretary General of the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO, to speak to us.
E nā mana, e nā reo, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Firstly, I just wanted to say thank you to the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand for inviting me to speak today. It is an honour to be part of today's commemorations. As Secretary General for the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO, I've attended these commemorations for over a decade, and the Commission has a long history of supporting Holocaust Day. It is a fitting relationship, as our organisations are based on the same foundations and our kaupapa align. UNESCO was established as a specialised agency of the UN after World War II to ensure that such wars didn't happen again, particularly the persecution of peoples, such as occurred with the Holocaust. At the heart of UNESCO is the belief that political and economic arrangements will not produce lasting peace, and the only certainty for world security is intellectual and moral solidarity. Every year, UNESCO reconfirms its unwavering commitment to counter anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of intolerance that may lead to group-targeted violence. Information sharing is central to all of this, and today, as we battle not only a pandemic, but also a barrage of disinformation, this has become even more important. Since its inception 75 years ago, UNESCO has worked hard to counteract disinformation. Unfortunately, it's never an easy job, even more so with the rise of social media and the associated ease of spreading ideas that are unsupported by robust evidence, and that all too often promote views that denigrate particular groups. Every person deserves to have access to quality information. Community-wide and community-based initiatives play an important role to share such information, particularly to ensure that people are able to develop fact-based views. And of course, the New Zealand Holocaust Centre is an excellent example of this, and I congratulate them on their ongoing efforts in this regard. When I reflected on today's theme, resistance, it stirred up a great deal of emotion. Thinking back to those that took part in the resistance movement, to their heart, to their bravery, no matter what their role, I have such admiration. And as Minister Robertson referenced earlier, the testimonies of Eva and Boyd earlier today, and indeed the last testimony that we just heard, are fantastic examples of extraordinary and inspirational action. Then there is the frustration of knowing that the word resistance has become the battle cry for those currently spreading disinformation. The Holocaust is being misused as an emotive tool to further the spreading of disinformation. Holocaust distortion is rife. This is incredibly heartbreaking to witness, and it is why today, more than ever, we need to continue to educate people about the Holocaust. Last year, UNESCO reconfirmed its commitment to advancing international Holocaust education during Director General Audrey Auzole's first official visit to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. And during her visit, she said, "There is no better long-term remedy for anti-Semitism than learning to think critically, learning to respect the dignity and freedom of others." At the National Commission, our approach is to work in partnership with communities to support freedom of responsible expression. And we want to bring together civil society and communities to discuss ways to celebrate diversity through an increased understanding of human rights and by supporting the building of a more inclusive society. This is why we've made freedom of responsible expression one of our 5 priority areas. It is why we allocate funding and support to days like today to help educate New Zealanders about lessons to learn from the past and the work of organisations such as the Holocaust Centre. I just want to stop there and pay tribute to Inga Wolf, who contributed so much to our work at the National Commission through her work at the Holocaust Centre and was a really inspirational teacher. One of the many ways that we bring together civil society and communities is through our UNESCO Aotearoa Youth Leaders Programme. We have a team of 10 youth leaders who serve as advisors, negotiating inclusive ways for young people to be engaged and empowered in the National Commission's priority and programme areas. As UNESCO ambassadors and change agents, the youth leaders work to build UNESCO's profile, identify where they can drive, support and collaborate with organisations, networks and initiatives that align with UNESCO's mandate. Our outgoing Special Advisor Youth, Shaheen Najak's here today, and I think some of you heard her present the UNESCO Director General's message out in Makara, and others represent the group in Auckland and Hamilton today. Our youth leaders come from diverse backgrounds. Many of them joined our team because they want to defend human rights and contribute to a democratic and healthy society. And when we look at resistance in history, youth were at the forefront. I just also want to acknowledge the winners of the Paul Seideman Prize. It's a fantastic presentations, and I think our future's quite secure with young people like yourselves. Much like those that went before them, today's youth play a crucial role in promoting human rights, stemming the flow of disinformation, and ensuring that robust information reaches their fellow youth in all communities around Aotearoa. And today, as her namesake Sophie mentioned and told her story rather beautifully, we're celebrating the legacy of resistance groups such as the White Rose, a non-violent intellectual resistant group in Nazi Germany led by students, including Sophie Scholl. Sophie personified the importance of acting according to one's beliefs and of following your conscience, even in the face of great sacrifice. Her story reminds us not to be silent and fight for what Sophie wrote on the back of her indictment a day before she was killed, freedom. Her story, and those of the others today, is one that needs to be told today and into the future. We'll be sharing her story today on social media, but of course it's important to continue to share similar stories on an ongoing basis throughout the year. Enabling people to understand the stories of those who have lost their lives for their cause and to understand the true cause goes some way towards fighting disinformation. I think it's only fitting to finish with a quote of Sophie's that resonates strongly today. Just because so many things are in conflict does not mean that we ourselves should be divided. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. I referred earlier to partisan resistance. A famous song from this time is the Partisans Song. This song was sung in ghettos and later by Holocaust survivors and at Holocaust memorials all over the world. Inspired by the story of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the song remains a powerful tribute to survival. The author, Hirsch Glick, was in his 20s when he wrote this song, was born and raised in Vilna. He spent much of his short life composing poems and songs of inspiration for his fellow Jews. Glick managed to flee when the Vilna ghetto was being liquidated in 1943, but was later captured. He was later deported to a concentration camp in Estonia. He escaped in 1944, but was never heard from again and was presumed captured and executed. The Partisans Song was written in Yiddish and has now very specially been translated into Te Reo Māori by Hemi Kelly, Ngāti Maniapoto, Ngāti Tahu, Ngāti Whaua of the Auckland University of Technology. You will hear now the very first public performance of this incredibly special version with the original organised by Ali Rabinowitz of the We Are Here Foundation in Perth. Anastasia Reid will perform with Liam Furey accompanying on the piano, both as students at the New Zealand School of Music.
niet keinmal als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Hast himmeln blauen, stillen blauen Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgeweckter Schau. Sveta pojkt und unser Trott mir seinen Dom. Kommen wird noch unser ausgeweckter Schau. Sveta pojkt und unser Trott mir seinen Dom. Vom grünen Palmenland bis weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen und mit unser Pein, mit unser Weg. Und Wege fallen, Cäsar spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird durch unser Glühe, unser Mut. Und Wege fallen, Cäsar spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird durch unser Glühe, unser Mut. Svett die Morgensonn begilden uns dem Heim. Und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit den Feind. Nur heute zusammen wird die Sonne in dem Gehör. Wie Partisans gehen das Lied von Tor zu Tor. Nur heute zusammen wird die Sonne in dem Gehör. Wie Partisans gehen das Lied von Tor zu Tor. Du sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Hast himmeln blauen, stille blaue Tag. Kommen weg noch unser ausgeweckter Schau. Sveta pojkt und unser Trott mir seinen Dom. Kommen weg noch unser ausgeweckter Schau. Sveta pojkt und unser Trott mir seinen Dom. Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist not kein Lied von a Vogel auf der Frei. Das rote deutsche Wind verlängt Gebend. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Das Hut auf und zwischen fallen die Gebend. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Korawa hemea kote mate aneto varahi. Aha koharayana teki koterangi ete puriuri. Kete tata maite wakara etariana. Arute fenwa ite tagianga waikite aka. Kete tata maite wakara etariana. Arute fenwa ite tagianga waikite aka. Maite fenwa ote niko kite fenwa koke ote uka. E hairene mato irunga ite kore ari me te tifa tifa. Katonga wai pepe ayo mato toto kite papa. Kapuawa mai rera tomato maya me tomato kama. Katonga wai pepe ayo mato toto kite papa. Kapuawa mai rera tomato maya tomato te tapa. Kafiti tonu te raite ataka te rangi. Katuanga raru ona nai kangaro me te hokakare. Akite rawa te waimu ai te aranga ai ono te ra. Tukwama tene wainga tue takamarama. Akite rawa te waimu ai te aranga mai.
Thank you for that incredibly special performance of what I think is a real taonga to have such an important and stirring song translated into Te Reo Māori for our context. Each year we become more separated by time from the events of the Holocaust. And whilst it's the Centre's mission to ensure that the passing of time does not amount to a passing of memory or a decrease in action, the reality is that each year we lose more very cherished survivors. Survivors carry with them the testimony, the memory, and the pain of the Holocaust. It is in their memory that the Centre carries out its work. We will now see a short tribute in memoriam to the Holocaust survivors resident in New Zealand who died during the past year. We really do honour the memories of their lives, and in particular I give mention to Inga Wolf, who was one of a group of founders of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. Inga's vision and drive is the reason for the many activities that the Holocaust Centre is responsible for today, and today's ceremony feels that little bit more empty without her here. On a slightly lighter note, Inga and the Centre featured in the Dom Post quiz on Monday, and if that's not a testament to someone's influence, I do not know what is. Friends, as we near the end of the ceremony and reflect on the what next, I am proud to update that the Holocaust Centre's strategy going forward is moving from strength to strength. We have advanced plans to open a centre in Auckland at the new Jewish Community Centre site, not to diminish the importance of the Wellington Centre, of course. We are delighted to have recently appointed our new CEO, Gillian West. Gillian, based in Auckland, has the skill set, passion and drive to take the centre forward and ensure that we continue to educate widely the lessons of the Holocaust. The work of the Holocaust Centre in itself is an act of resistance, the theme of this year's Memorial Day. I invite you to consider what you can do to shape resistance in your everyday life against prejudice, injustice and anti-Semitism. I invite you to use this ceremony of reflection to motivate action going forward. Thank you for taking part in this afternoon's ceremony. It is a deeply important ceremony of significance for the Jewish community and also for the people of Wellington and New Zealand. And to quote from the Governor-General's message a year ago, the March 15 mosque attacks and the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us the power of unity. We must celebrate our differences and look at each other with humanity and kindness. We must pledge never again. I also want to thank those who have had a part in organising today. Much thought, time and energy goes into putting a ceremony like this together, and much logistical manoeuvring is particularly needed in a pandemic year. Thank you.